The paper shook in Mae Carter's hand, but her voice did not. "This says I have 30 days, she said, standing in the middle of Joel Fletcher's front yard with the August sun beating down on the crown of her black mourning bonnet. "But the man who sent it told me I had 3. Joel Fletcher looked at the woman on his porch steps and felt the ground shift beneath him in a way it hadn't since the afternoon his father died. She was maybe 28, maybe 30, with dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of weeks without proper sleep, and a jaw set with the kind of stubborn fury that only comes from someone who has been pushed past every reasonable limit. She held the foreclosure notice in one hand and a folded letter in the other, and her green eyes were burning with something that walked the razor edge between desperation and rage. 3 days, he repeated slowly. Cornelius Hatch told my foreman that if I couldn't repay the note my husband signed against the Carter land, he would move men in by Friday. That's 3 days from now, Mr. Fletcher, not 30. She thrust both papers toward him. And your name is on this letter, your signature. Right there under Hatch's. The blood drained from Joel's face. He took the letter from her hand and read it, and the world contracted around him like a fist closing. His name was there, sure enough. His signature, or something that looked exactly like it, authorizing Cornelius Hatch to accelerate the foreclosure timeline on the Carter parcel if the widow failed to respond within 72 hours of notice. He had never written that letter. He had never signed it. He had never, in the 34 years of his life on this earth, met Mae Carter before this moment. But she didn't know that yet. And the way she was looking at him, with those green eyes full of something that might turn to tears if she let it, told him that she had ridden 4 miles in the August heat believing he was part of the trap set to take everything she had left in this world. Looked up from the letter and met her gaze. "I didn't write this," he said. "Your name is on it." "My name is on it," he agreed. "And I'm telling you, Mrs. Carter, that I did not write it, I did not sign it, and I did not authorize Cornelius Hatch to do a single thing with your land." She stared at him for a long moment. The cicadas screamed in the cottonwoods. A horse shifted in the corral. Then Mae Carter did something he did not expect at all. She asked her question. Then who did? That was the question. And Joel Fletcher had until sundown to answer it, because if he didn't, by Friday morning, a widow woman would lose the only thing her dead husband had left her, and a criminal who had spent the better part of 2 years building an empire of forged documents and crooked loans across Colfax County, New Mexico, would have gotten away with it. It was the summer of 1883, and the land deals were killing people just as surely as any gunfight. To understand how Mae Carter came to be standing in Joel Fletcher's yard with a forgery in her hand and rage in her eyes, you had to go back 6 months, to February, to the week Thomas Carter froze to death in a blizzard while trying to save a herd of cattle that weren't worth saving. Thomas had been a kind man, Mae always said, a patient man. But patient men in New Mexico territory in 1883 had a way of getting buried before their time, because patience didn't protect you from the cold, and it didn't protect you from men like Cornelius Hatch. Hatch had ridden into Cimarron about 2 years prior, arriving from somewhere east that he never named with a leather satchel full of investment papers, and a smile that Mae had distrusted from the moment she first saw it across the main street. He set himself up as a land agent and money lender, which was a respectable enough occupation, and he had a talent for finding ranchers who were struggling and offering them exactly the kind of loan that seemed like salvation until you read the fine print. Thomas Carter had borrowed against 20 acres of the eastern pasture in October, when the cattle prices dropped and the hay stores ran low. He had shaken Hatch's hand and signed his name and told me it was just until spring. Thomas never saw spring. When Mae buried him in February, she was 30 years old, the mother of a 7-year-old girl named Clara, the owner of a cattle operation that was barely breathing, and the holder of a debt she hadn't fully understood until she sat down with the loan papers by lamplight the night after the funeral. The interest was brutal. The terms were structured so that if she missed a single payment, Hatch could call the entire note due. And Hatch, as it turned out, had no intention of waiting for spring. He had sent the foreclosure notice 3 weeks after Thomas was in the ground. Mae had spent those 3 weeks in a fog of grief that she couldn't afford to stay inside, pulling herself upright every morning and telling herself that Clara needed her to be strong, that the land was Clara's inheritance, that Thomas would not want her to give up. She had found a foreman, a steady older man named Walt Greer who had worked cattle his whole life and who had known Thomas since boyhood. She had cut expenses to the bone. She had written 3 letters to Hatch requesting an extension and received 2 dismissive replies and 1 silence. And then, last week, Walt had come to her with the letter bearing Joel Fletcher's name. Walt knew Joel Fletcher by reputation. Most people in the northern part of the territory did. Fletcher ran the largest cattle operation in the county, the Broken Spur Ranch, 2,000 acres of good grazing land that his father had built, and Joel had expanded through nothing more glamorous than relentless hard work and honest dealing. He was known as a fair man, a serious man, a man who paid his debts and expected others to pay theirs. He was not known as the kind of man who would conspire with a vulture like Cornelius Hatch to steal a widow's land. But his name is on it, Walt had said, his old face troubled. Me, I don't know what to make of it. Mae had stared at that letter for 3 days before deciding what to do. She could go to the county sheriff, but the sheriff in Cimarron had a relationship with Hatch that she found uncomfortable and suspicious. She could go to a lawyer, but the only lawyer in town was Hatch's friend. She could do nothing and lose the land on Friday, or she could go directly to Joel Fletcher and look the man in the eye. So she had saddled her horse before dawn, told Walt to watch Clara, and ridden 4 miles through the August heat to a ranch she had never visited, to confront a man she had never met, with a forgery in her hand and nothing but desperation to fuel her. And now she was standing in his yard, and he was reading the letter with an expression that looked like genuine shock, and she was trying very hard to decide whether she believed him. Joel handed the letter back to her and said, "Come inside out of the heat." She hesitated. He saw it. He understood it. A widow woman alone on a stranger's property, already believing this man might be her enemy. He stepped back from the door and left it fully open, which was as much space as he could give her. "I'll have my housekeeper bring water," he said. "And then I want to hear everything from the beginning, because whoever forged that signature has made this my problem too." Mae Carter stepped inside the Broken Spur Ranch house, and everything changed. The house was clean in the way that houses are clean when someone lives in them rather than simply existing in them. There were books on a shelf, a map of the territory tacked to one wall, a woman's quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair near the window, which struck me as odd until she noticed the small portrait on the mantelpiece of a woman with Joel's same dark eyes, and she understood that the quilt had belonged to his mother. A woman named Rosa, compact and no-nonsense and perhaps 60 years old, appeared from the kitchen with a pitcher of water and 2 glasses, and set them on the table with the efficient calm of someone who had spent a lifetime managing things. She looked at me with sharp dark eyes that held more compassion than suspicion, and me felt some of the tightness in her chest loosen by 1 degree. Joel Fletcher sat across the table from her and folded his hands and said, "Tell me about Cornelius Hatch." So she told him. She told him about October and the loan. She told him about Thomas's death and the blizzard and the frozen pasture and the buried man. She told him about the foreclosure notice and the letters and the silence. She told him about Walt and the forged signature and the 3 days. She told him about Clara, because somehow that came out too, how Clara was 7 and stubborn and had her father's red hair, and did not yet fully understand that the world was trying to take her home. Joel listened. He did not interrupt her once. He did not offer false comfort or hollow reassurances. He simply listened, and when she finished, the silence in the room felt different from before, less like a gap and more like something being built. "Hatch forged my signature," Joel said, "because he needed cover." He needed someone whose name carries weight in this county to make the acceleration look legitimate. If people see my name on the authorization, they assume I've looked at the situation and found it warranted. Nobody questions Joel Fletcher's judgment. That's the trap. He said the word trap with a cold anger that me recognized as the kind that runs deep. He used my reputation to hide his theft. Can you prove it's a forgery? I have every letter I've written in the last 2 years copied in my ledger. Every single one. He stood and moved to a desk in the corner of the room, opening a leather-bound book that was thick with copied correspondence. He leafed through it with the efficiency of a man who kept meticulous records, and within a minute he was pressing his finger to a page. Look at this. My actual signature. Now look at what's on that letter. Me placed the letter beside the open ledger and looked. It took her only a moment. The forgery was close. Whoever had done it had some skill. But the F in Fletcher had a particular sweep to it in Joel's real signature that was missing in the forgery, and the J had a sharp downstroke that the forger had softened. Small differences, but real ones. A handwriting examiner would see this immediately, Joel said. The nearest handwriting examiner who isn't in Hatch's pocket is probably in Santa Fe, me said. Then we go to Santa Fe. She looked at him. In 3 days. Joel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, no, we don't have 3 days to go to Santa Fe. We have today. He moved back to the table and sat down again, and me watched him think. She could see it happening, the way his dark eyes moved in the slightly unfocused way of a man who was running through possibilities at speed. She had watched Thomas think like that, though Thomas had been slower and gentler, and the comparison brought a pang that she buried quickly because she could not afford to feel it right now. Hatch needs the forgery to hold up just long enough to get men on your land, Joel said. Once he has physical possession, getting him off becomes 10 times harder. The law in this territory has a bias toward whoever is standing on the ground. He looked up at her. How many men does he have? I don't know exactly. Maybe 6. Walt says there are always men around Hatch's office. Hired guns, not ranch workers. And you have Walt and who else? 2 young hands, Billy and Sam. They're good boys, but they're not fighters. Joel nodded slowly. Here's what I know about Cornelius Hatch. He arrived in Cimarron in the fall of 1881. I looked into him when he first started operating because I had a man approach me about investing in one of his land schemes, and something felt wrong. What I found was that his real name is Cornelius Hatcher, and before he came here, he was operating the same scheme in Las Vegas, New Mexico. He'd take loans secured against land, falsify documents to accelerate foreclosure, acquire the land at pennies on the dollar, and sell it off to railroad interests. 3 families lost land that way before someone figured out what he was doing and he had to move on. Me stared at him. You knew this and you didn't report it. I reported it to the sheriff 18 months ago. Showed him everything I'd found. The sheriff told me I didn't have proof of anything happening in this county and that a man couldn't be arrested for what he'd done somewhere else. Joel's jaw tightened. I've been watching Hatch ever since, waiting for him to make a move I could catch him on. I should have pushed harder, I know that. I didn't know he was going to use your family. The honesty of that sat between them. No excuses, no deflection. Just the plain acknowledgement that he had not done enough and the weight of that knowledge on his face. Me took a breath. What do? We go to Cimarron, Joel said. Today, right now. We find the clerk of the district court, a man named Harold Pitts who I trust, and we file an emergency injunction to halt the foreclosure pending investigation of the forged document. It won't get you out of the debt, but it will stop Hatch from putting men on your land Friday. And if the injunction doesn't hold, then we go to the territorial government. I have a contact in the governor's office. This is an election year, and the governor is very interested in stories about corrupt land agents stealing from widows. Joel said it without drama, as a simple fact. Men like Hatch depend on the machinery of legitimate law to do their dirty work. The moment the machinery starts working against them instead of for them, their power collapses. Me was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him with those green eyes, and the assessment in them was thorough and unsentimental. She was deciding whether to trust him. He understood that. He didn't push. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. "You don't know me. Helping me costs you time and probably money and potentially makes you an enemy of a man who apparently has no problem forging your name on criminal documents." Joel looked at her steadily. "Because he forged my name. That makes it my problem regardless of whether I wanted it to be. And because it's the right thing to do." Paused. "And because I've been waiting 18 months for a reason to bring Hatch down, and you just walked through my door with it." Mae Carter looked at Joel Fletcher for one more long moment. Then she put both papers on the table, smoothed them flat with her palm, and said, "All right, let's go to Cimarron." They rode into town side by side, which was not a thing that Mae had done with any man since Thomas died, and the awareness of it was strange and uncomfortable in a way she didn't examine too closely. Joel rode a gray gelding that moved with a smooth, easy gait, and he sat a horse the way men who had grown up on ranches sat horses, completely naturally, as though the animal was simply an extension of himself. He didn't talk much on the ride, which suited me, who had enough to think about. Cimarron in August was dusty and loud and smelled of horses and cattle and the particular dry heat of the high desert. The main street was busy with the kind of commerce that happened in any small western town: wagons and horses and men conducting the business of ranching and farming, and the 100 small industries that supported them. Mae had ridden this street 100 times. She knew most of the faces she saw. Several people looked at her with the expression she had grown accustomed to since Thomas died, a mixture of pity and the slight, uncomfortable distance that the living kept from the grieving, as though sorrow were somehow contagious. Nobody had an expression like that for Joel Fletcher. The looks he got were respect, pure and unambiguous. Men tipped their hats. A woman outside the general store called a greeting. He returned every acknowledgement with the same brief, courteous nod. Harold Pitts, the court clerk, was a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and the carefully cultivated air of someone who took his position in the machinery of justice very seriously. He looked at the forgery and at Joel's ledger side by side, and his thin face went through several expressions in rapid succession. "This is a serious accusation," he said. "This is a serious forgery," Joel replied. "And there is a woman standing in your office who is going to lose her land on Friday if you don't file an emergency injunction today." Harold Pitts looked at me. She looked back at him. She had put away the desperate edge from earlier and replaced it with the careful, composed manner of a woman conducting legal business, because she understood that men in official positions responded better to composure than to desperation. "The debt itself is legitimate?" Harold asked her. "My husband signed the note." "Yes, the debt is real. What is not legitimate is Cornelius Hatch's claim that he has authorization from Joel Fletcher to accelerate the foreclosure timeline. That letter is a forgery." Harold looked at the two signatures again for a long moment. He was quiet in the way of a man making a calculation that involved both the law and his own safety. Cimarron was a small town. Cornelius Hatch was a man with hired guns and a relationship with the sheriff. Harold Pitts was a court clerk with ink-stained fingers. "I'll need you to sign an affidavit," Harold said to Joel, "swearing that this signature is not yours." "I brought my ledger," Joel said. "I'll sign whatever you need." It took 2 hours. 2 hours of careful, procedural paperwork in a small hot office with a fly buzzing against the window. While Mae sat on a hard wooden chair and Joel stood at the counter, and Harold Pitts wrote in his small, precise hand and looked nervous at intervals. By the time they walked out of the clerk's office, the injunction had been filed, and Cornelius Hatch could not legally move men onto the Carter property until a judge had reviewed the dispute. The sun was moving toward the mountains in the west. It was late afternoon. "You said before sundown," Mae said, stopping on the boardwalk outside the clerk's office. She was looking at the street, not at him. "Both. The foreclosure notice and the question." Joel stood beside her. "The notice is handled for now. And the question was who forged my signature. I told you who. You told me it was Hatch, but you don't know for certain who actually did the physical writing. No, Joel agreed. I don't. Yet, me turned to look at him, and the afternoon light was doing something complicated to her face, catching the tired lines around her eyes and making them look less like exhaustion and more like history. She had been through something terrible and she was still standing. He found himself acutely aware of that, of the specific courage it took to still be standing when the world had collapsed on you. Thank you, she said. It came out simply, without performance, and it landed that way. Don't thank me yet, he said. The injunction slows Hatch down. It doesn't stop him. And a man like that, when he's been slowed down, tends to find other ways. As if to confirm that prediction, the sheriff walked out of the building across the street. Sheriff Dale Morrow was a broad, slow-moving man who had been the law in Cimarron for 6 years, and who had arrived at the kind of institutional corruption that doesn't happen all at once, but accumulates gradually, deal by small deal, favor by small favor, until the man who started out with good intentions is something else entirely. He saw Joel and me on the boardwalk and his expression went carefully neutral, which was itself a kind of tell. Mrs. Carter, he said, crossing to them, didn't expect to see you in town today. I had business, me said. Business with Joel Fletcher. With the court clerk, Joel said. We've filed an injunction against a fraudulent foreclosure proceeding. I expect you've heard that there's been some document fraud in connection with the Carter debt. Morrow's eyes moved between them. I hadn't heard that. You'll hear it now, Joel said. Someone forged my signature on an authorization letter to Cornelius Hatch. I've filed a sworn affidavit with Harold Pitts. The injunction halts any action against the Carter property until the matter is reviewed by a judge. He said it calmly and evenly, not as a challenge but as a statement of fact. I thought you'd want to know, in your capacity as the law in this county. Morrow was quiet for a moment. I'll look into it, he said finally. I'd appreciate that, Joel said. There was nothing confrontational in his tone. There didn't need to be. They both understood exactly what had been communicated. Morrow tipped his hat to me, gave Joel one more careful look, and walked on. He'll go straight to Hatch, me said quietly once the sheriff was out of earshot. Within the hour, Joel agreed. Which means we have until this evening before Hatch starts thinking about how to counter the injunction. He looked at her. Is there somewhere you can stay tonight that isn't the Carter ranch? I'd rather Hatch not know where you are while he's deciding what to do. Me shook her head. I have Clara at home, and Walt, I'm not leaving them. Joel had expected that. All right, then I'm coming with you. Mr. Fletcher, that's not necessary. A man who forges legal documents and employs hired guns is not going to respect an injunction the moment he decides his interests outweigh the risk, Joel said. He might wait a day. He might wait until he figures out his next move. He might not wait at all. I'm not leaving you to manage that alone with a 7-year-old and 2 ranch hands. He said it without drama, as simple logic. If you want me to sleep in the barn, I'll sleep in the barn. Me looked at him for a long moment. She was doing that thing again, that unsentimental assessment, looking for the hidden motive, the trap inside the offer. He let her look. You can sleep in the bunkhouse, she said. Walt can show you where. They were back on their horses within 20 minutes and riding out of Cimarron as the sun began to redden in the west. Me thought about what had happened in the last 12 hours, how she had left her house before dawn with nothing but fury and desperation, and how she was returning with a legal injunction and an ally she hadn't expected, and how the day was not over yet. The Carter ranch was smaller than the Broken Spur. That was obvious from a quarter-mile away. The house was solid and well-built but modest, the kind of house that a man builds when he expects to have more time to improve it later. The yard had the slightly untended look of a place where labor had been stretched thin, where the things that weren't strictly necessary had been let go for the sake of the things that were. A kitchen garden near the side of the house was doing well, which told Joel something about me. She had kept the kitchen garden going even in the worst of it. Walt Greer came out of the barn when they rode in, a weathered man in his mid-50s with a careful, watchful quality that Joel recognized as the look of someone who had appointed himself a protector and was taking the job seriously. "Who's this?" Walt asked me, without hostility but without warmth either. "Joel Fletcher," Mae said, swinging down from her horse. "He didn't write the letter, Walt, and we filed an injunction today in Cimarron. Hatch can't move on the land until it goes before a judge." Walt's eyebrows lifted. He looked at Joel with a reassessment happening visibly behind his eyes. "Joel Fletcher of Broken Spur." "The same," Joel said. "Your father built that ranch," Walt said. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement, the way older men acknowledge certain things with the respect due to work that lasted. "He did. I've been trying not to ruin what he built." Walt almost smiled. "Mae says you can use the bunkhouse." "I appreciate it." Walt turned to me. "Clara's inside. She ate her supper already. She's been asking about you." Mae's face changed when she heard her daughter's name. The composure didn't disappear exactly, but something came through it, something warm and a little raw. "I'll go in," she said. She glanced at Joel. "Rose's cooking is probably better than anything I can offer tonight, but there's food." "I'm fine," he said. "Go see your daughter." She went inside, and Joel stood in the yard with Walt Greer, and the two men looked at each other in the way of men who were measuring each other up with nothing aggressive about it, just the mutual taking of a measure. "She rode all the way to your place herself?" Walt asked. "She did, with a forgery and no guarantee of how she'd be received." Walt was quiet for a moment. "That's Mae Carter," he said. It was the simplest possible description of someone and also the most complete. "Tell me about Hatch's men," Joel said. "Who are they and how many?" Walt told him. There were 7 that he'd seen, at various times around Hatch's office and around the saloon that Hatch also owned. 3 were clearly professional hired guns, men who wore their weapons like tools rather than ornaments. The other 4 were harder to classify, maybe hired muscle, maybe just men who needed work and had found it in the wrong place. Walt didn't know any of them by name except one, a man called Doyle who was Hatch's shadow, always present, always watching, with the flat eyes of someone who had done things he decided not to feel about. "Doyle is the dangerous one," Walt said. "The others follow. Doyle leads." Joel filed that away. "If Hatch decides the injunction isn't going to slow him down, he'll send Doyle first." "That's my thinking." "All right." Joel looked at the bunkhouse, at the yard, at the road coming in from the east. The ranch had a defensible quality if you thought about it in those terms. A good sightline from the house to the main road, the barn positioned as a natural second point. You wouldn't want to be here with 2 ranch hands against 7 men, but you wouldn't want to be caught in the open either. "We'll need to be ready." "Not to fight if we can help it, but ready," Walt nodded. "You eat yet today?" "No." "Come on then." They ate in the ranch kitchen, the 5 of them, Walt and Joel and Billy and Sam, the 2 young hands who were maybe 19 and 20, and who looked at Joel with the kind of wide, careful attention that young men gave to someone whose reputation they respected. Mae sat with them for a while after she'd seen to Clara, eating something quickly and listening as the men talked through what they knew and what they could do. Clara appeared once briefly in the doorway of the kitchen, a small person with vivid red hair and her mother's sharp eyes, wearing a nightgown and clutching a rag doll with the focused intensity of a child who is pretending to be casual while actually taking in everything. She looked at Joel with frank, unfiltered curiosity. "Are you the man from the big ranch?" she asked. "I am," Joel said. "My name is Joel Fletcher. My mama went to see you today." "She did. She was very brave." Clara considered this. "She's always brave," she said, as a simple statement of fact, and then she disappeared back into the hallway. Mae was looking at the spot where her daughter had been, and her expression was the most unguarded Joel had seen from her all day. The love in it was complete and unconditional and a little terrifying in its depth. He understood suddenly, with more force than he had before, what was at stake for her. Not land, not money, her daughter's future, her daughter's home. He looked away because it felt like looking at something private. The night came in slowly, the way summer nights did in the high desert, with a long blue twilight that stretched across the mountains and filled the valley with a gentle, cooling darkness. The stars came out in their thousands. Joel sat on the step of the bunkhouse for an hour after supper, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into itself, the horses in the corral, the crickets in the grass, the distant sound of an owl. He was thinking about Cornelius Hatch and the forgery and the trap that had been laid, and he was thinking about Mae Carter and the specific quality of her courage, which was not the theatrical courage of men who wore it like a costume, but the quiet, daily courage of someone who gets up every morning and does what needs to be done regardless of how much it costs. He didn't have a name for what he felt about her yet. It was too new, and the circumstances were too serious. But there was something there, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it, even if only in the dark. He went asleep on a narrow bunk with his boots off and his revolver within reach, and his mind still working through the problem. The knock came at 3 in the morning, not at the bunkhouse door but at the ranch house door, loud and deliberate, and Joel was on his feet and moving before the second knock landed. He had his boots on and his revolver in his hand by the time he came out of the bunkhouse into the yard, and Walt was already at the barn door with a shotgun, and Billy was appearing from the far end of the corral. There was a man on the porch. One man alone, which was either a sign of confidence or a sign that the others were somewhere Joel couldn't see. He moved toward the house along the line of shadow, not announcing himself, watching. Mae opened the door. It was Doyle. Joel had imagined Doyle from Walt's description, and the reality was close to accurate. Tall, lean, a face that had been weathered past character into something simpler and colder, with the flat eyes Walt had mentioned. He was holding nothing. His hands were open. He was making a point of not reaching for his weapon, which meant he was here to talk, which meant Hatch had something he wanted to say. "Message from Mr. Hatch," Doyle said, his voice carrying easily in the night quiet. He had an Eastern accent, not strong but present. "He says the injunction is temporary and that he has a legal team reviewing it. He says he's willing to negotiate the terms of the note if Mrs. Carter wants to avoid a prolonged court dispute." Mae was standing in the doorway in a dark robe, her hair loose, holding herself with the same composure she had in daylight. "Tell Mr. Hatch that I'll receive his proposal in writing, delivered to Harold Pitts at the court clerk's office, and that any negotiation will happen through the court." Doyle didn't move. His flat eyes had found Joel in the shadows, and he looked at him for a moment with the professional assessment of someone pricing a problem. "Mr. Hatch also says that Mr. Fletcher might want to consider whether he wants to be involved in a complicated legal dispute over a neighboring property," Doyle said, "given that Mr. Fletcher has his own operation to manage." "Tell Mr. Hatch," Joel said, stepping into the light, "that Mr. Fletcher has already considered it, and that the next time Hatch wants to send a message, he can do it in daylight in town through proper legal channels like a man who has nothing to hide." He paused. "Which Mr. Hatch is not." Doyle looked at him for another long moment. Then he nodded once with the unhurried calm of someone who has been in enough situations to know when an escalation is available and when it isn't. He stepped off the porch and walked to his horse at the gate and rode away into the dark without hurrying. Joel waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded entirely before he let himself exhale. "He'll be back," Walt said from across the yard. "With more people," Billy added, sounding young and honest about his own uncertainty. "Yes," Joel said, "but not tonight. He was testing us, seeing who was here, how we were positioned, whether there was a weakness to probe." He looked at me, who was still in the doorway. "Go back inside, lock the door. I'll stay in the yard until dawn." She looked at him. There was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, something softer than assessment, something that had to do with the way he had stepped out of the shadow when he didn't have to. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you. We can watch from the windows. There's no point standing in the cold." The night passed without further incident. Mae made coffee at some point well before dawn, and they sat at the kitchen table in the strange, intimate silence of shared sleeplessness, she and Joel and Walt, while Billy and Sam kept watch from the barn. They talked quietly about practical things, about the court process and how long an injunction hearing might take, about whether the territorial marshal could be involved if the judge they drew was hostile to the case, about whether there were other families in the county that Hatch had victimized who might testify. And at some point in the gray pre-dawn light, Mae said, "Thomas would have liked you." It came out without warning, and Joel saw that it surprised her as much as it surprised him. She looked slightly startled by her own words and then composed again quickly. "Tell me about him," Joel said, so she did. She told him about Thomas Carter, who had come to New Mexico from Missouri with $30 and a determination to make something, who had built this ranch with his own hands over 10 years, who had been unfailingly kind to everyone who crossed his path and who had believed, with a faith that was almost simple in its purity, that honesty and hard work were sufficient armor against the world. They weren't. He died at 32 in a blizzard trying to save cattle that were already lost, and Mae had spent 6 months trying to figure out if she was angry at him for that or only heartbroken. "Both," Joel said quietly. She looked at him. "You can be angry at someone you love for dying," he said. "It doesn't mean you love them less, it just means you're human." Mae was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother," he nodded. "My mother died 4 years ago. She was sick for 2 years first, and I was angry for a long time that she'd taken so long, because it was 2 years of watching her disappear and not being able to stop it." He looked at the quilt through the open door of the sitting room, the quilt draped over the rocking chair. "I kept the quilt. That's probably strange." "It's not strange at all," Mae said. Walt had fallen asleep in his chair, his chin on his chest, his breathing deep and even. Outside the window, the sky was turning from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before dawn. The ranch was quiet. They sat in that kitchen in the early morning, Joel Fletcher and Mae Carter, and they did not touch, and they did not say anything that could be called romantic. And yet something was happening between them that both of them felt clearly and neither of them could look at directly yet. The shared sleeplessness and the serious purpose and the small true things they had said to each other in the dark had built something that was not yet love, but was its certain precursor. When the sun came up, Joel went back to the bunkhouse and washed his face and changed his shirt and came back to find me in the kitchen garden with her hair up and her sleeves rolled, pulling weeds with the focused efficiency of someone who finds physical work clarifying. Clara was beside her, handling the smaller weeds with great seriousness, presenting each one to her mother for approval before discarding it. Joel watched them from the porch for a moment before making himself known. "Morning," he said. Clara looked up immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher. Mama says you stayed to help." "I did. Are you going to stay again tonight?" Joel looked at me, who was looking at him with an expression that had gone back to careful and composed, but with something warm underneath it that hadn't been there yesterday. "That depends," Joel said, "on what happens today." What happened today was this. Joel sent a wire from the telegraph office in Cimarron to his contact in the governor's office in Santa Fe, a man named Peter Daltrey who handled land policy and who had been trying to build a case against corrupt land agents in the territory for 2 years. The wire was detailed and included the critical fact of the forged signature, which transformed the matter from a civil loan dispute into a criminal fraud case. Daltrey wired back within the hour. He was coming to Cimarron. Then Joel went to see the judge. The district judge for the county was a man named Herbert Cole, who was honest in the way that many people in official positions in 1883 were honest, which is to say that he was honest when it was straightforward, and he found honesty comfortable. He was not the kind of man who took extraordinary stands. Joel knew this about him and worked with it, presenting the case not as an act of justice against corruption, but as a simple legal matter, a forged document, a verifiable fraud, an injunction that needed to be confirmed pending a full hearing. Cole was uncomfortable, but he was not in Hatch's pocket in the way the sheriff was. He confirmed the injunction. Joel came back to the Carter ranch that afternoon with these developments in hand, and Mae met him at the gate, and the look on her face when he told her about Daltrey was not just relief. It was something that went deeper than relief, the beginning of a belief that this might actually be resolved, that the dark past 6 months might be about to give way to something different. "How long until he arrives?" she asked. 2 days, maybe 3. 2 days. They had to hold Hatch off for 2 more days. Which was when things got complicated in the way that they had a habit of doing when dangerous men felt their plans slipping away. Hatch made his move the next afternoon, but it wasn't the move any of them had expected. He didn't send Doyle. He didn't send anyone to the ranch. Instead, he went to Harold Pitts at the court clerk's office and presented 3 documents that he claimed invalidated the injunction. Joel didn't find out about it until Billy rode in from town at a hard gallop with the news. And by then it was 4 in the afternoon, with the sun going sideways and everything in the balance again. Joel read the documents that Billy had managed to get copies of and felt a cold, focused anger settle through him. Hatch had produced what appeared to be a prior agreement, signed by Thomas Carter before his death, giving Hatch the right to accelerate foreclosure without requiring third-party authorization. If the document was legitimate, the injunction was based on a false premise. The forged Joel Fletcher letter became irrelevant because the real authorization was this prior agreement. "Is it legitimate?" Mae asked, her voice very quiet. Joel looked at her. "Did Thomas ever mention signing anything like this?" "Never. He told me everything, every paper he signed." She shook her head. "He was careful that way, even if he was not always wise." "Then it's another forgery. Or it's real and Thomas didn't tell me." That was the hidden fear underneath her voice, the dark possibility that her husband had not been what she believed, that the marriage had contained secrets. Joel saw it on her face and understood the particular cruelty of it. Hatch was not just trying to take her land. He was trying to make her doubt her husband. "Thomas Carter told Walt Greer everything too," Joel said, "and Walt's known him for 30 years. If Thomas had signed something like this, Walt would know." He paused. "Do you want to ask him?" they asked him. Walt's answer was immediate and certain. Thomas had never mentioned such an agreement. Thomas had never mentioned anything beyond the initial note, and Walt had been present at the signing of the note and had read it himself afterward because Thomas trusted his judgment, and there had been no clause of any kind about acceleration without notice. "It's another forgery," Walt said. "2 forgeries," Joel said. "Which means someone in this scheme has a very good hand and access to enough background documents to make the forgeries convincing. That's not improvised. That was planned well in advance." He sat down with the Thomas Carter note, the real one, the one Mae had shown him the first day. He looked at it carefully, with the kind of attention he'd been giving to the letter. The signatures were his and Thomas's, both real, both verifiable. And then he saw it. It was subtle enough that a man not specifically looking would walk past it. The paper of the note was slightly different from the paper of the document Hatch had produced today, not in a way you'd notice casually. But Joel had spent a morning staring at paper and signatures, and the new document was printed on stock that was slightly whiter, slightly more uniform in texture than the note. It was the kind of difference that would only matter to someone who knew what paper in 1882 actually looked and felt like, as opposed to paper produced more recently. "The prior agreement was written recently," Joel said. "The paper is wrong. Thomas Carter signed a note in October 1882, and the paper Hatch just produced is from stock that wasn't available in this territory until at least 6 months ago." Mae looked at him with wide eyes. "Can you prove that?" "Peter Daltrey can prove it. The territorial government has access to paper merchants' records." He stood. "I need to wire Daltrey again." He rode to Cimarron and sent the wire and rode back. And by the time he returned, the sun was low, and the ranch had that particular end-of-day quiet that he was beginning to associate with this place, with the sound of Clara somewhere inside the house and the smell of supper cooking, and the horses in the corral settling for the night. Mae was on the porch when he rode in. She had taken her hair down, and it was loose around her shoulders, dark and thick, and she was watching the western sky, where the sun was going down in layers of red and gold over the Cimarron Range. She turned when she heard him, and there was a quality in the way she looked at him, comfortable and attentive at once, that did something to his chest. "Did you get the wire off?" she asked. "I did. Daltrey will be here by tomorrow evening if he leaves at first light." Mae nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "Joel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. She said it without seeming to notice she'd done it, which was its own kind of thing. "What do you think Hatch will do tonight?" "Nothing," Joel said, tying his horse to the post. "He presented a counter-document today. He'll wait to see if it holds. He's a careful man for all that he's a criminal. He works through the system when he can." He stepped up onto the porch and stood beside her, looking at the same mountains. "The irony is that the system has worked for him this long because everyone expected corruption to look like gunfights. It looks like paperwork." "That's a very specific kind of evil," Mae said. "Yes, it is." She turned to look at him directly. "Why aren't you married?" she asked. The question came out with a frankness that was entirely characteristic of her but still surprised him. He was quiet for a moment. "There was a woman," he said, 4 years ago. Her name was Elena. She was from a family in Colorado, respectable people, good people. We were engaged." He paused. "She decided that a ranch in New Mexico was not the life she wanted, that I was too settled in a place and too unlikely to leave it. She went back to Colorado." "Were you heartbroken?" "Yes," he said honestly, "for a while. And then I understood that she had been right, not about me but about herself. She needed something different than what I had to offer, and marrying a woman when you know she needs something different is its own kind of cruelty." He looked at the mountains. "I've been running the Broken Spur alone since then. Rosa keeps the house. Walt's counterpart at my place is a man named Hector who has been there longer than I have. It's a full life." "But quiet," Mae said, "very quiet." They stood in the quiet of the Carter ranch porch, which was not the same as his quiet, and both of them knew it. "I don't know what I'm doing," Mae said softly, not self-pityingly, just honestly. "I mean that practically. I know what I'm doing moment to moment, but the larger picture. Thomas has been gone 6 months and I haven't let myself think past the next crisis. Because if I think past the next crisis, I have to think about the rest of my life, and that's too large." She paused. "Clara asks me sometimes if we're going to be all right. I always tell her yes, I always believe it while I'm saying it." "You will be," Joel said. She looked at him sideways. "You can't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I've watched you in 2 days do things that most people wouldn't attempt in 2 months, so the balance of probability is in your favor." She almost smiled. It was the first time he had seen her come close to it, and it changed her face, briefly, into something lighter and younger, and he thought he would very much like to see her actually smile someday. Peter Daltrey arrived the following evening, riding in from Santa Fe with 2 men who were investigators from the Territorial Marshal's office. And from that point on, the machinery of legitimate law, functioning as it was meant to function, began to move at a pace that surprised everyone, including Joel. Daltrey was 40, compact, precise, with the manner of someone who had spent years translating injustice into the language of bureaucracy and had become very good at it. He looked at every document, asked sharp questions, and within an hour of his arrival had formed a complete picture of Cornelius Hatch's operation that went well beyond what had happened to the Carter ranch. "He's done this 7 times in this territory in 2 years, Daltrey said, sitting at the Carter kitchen table with papers spread before him. "We've suspected it, but the cases were always just thin enough that we couldn't make them stick. This one is different because of the forged signatures. We have a directly verifiable crime, not just a pattern of suspicious practices." "What happens to the prior agreement he filed today?" Joel asked. "We're going to request the original document and have it examined. The paper merchant records you mentioned are key. If the paper is from stock that wasn't available in 1882, the document cannot be authentic, full stop." Daltrey looked at me. "Mrs. Carter, I want to be honest with you. This process will take several weeks, possibly longer. The injunction will hold, but Hatch will fight at every stage. Let him fight, Mae said. Daltrey nodded. That's the attitude that wins these cases. The arrest of Cornelius Hatch happened 3 days later at his office in Cimarron in the middle of the morning, with 2 territorial marshals and Harold Pitts and the county judge all present. Joel didn't witness it directly. He heard about it from Walt, who had been in town when it happened. Hatch had apparently been very calm, which was either admirable or simply the response of a man who had already decided on his legal strategy. Doyle had not been in the office. He left town that same day, which the marshals noted but couldn't immediately act on. The paper evidence was damning. The document examiner brought from Santa Fe confirmed that the prior agreement had been written on paper stock from a supply company that had not sold paper of that specification in New Mexico territory until January 1883. Thomas Carter had been dead by then. The forgery was absolute. Joel came back to the Carter ranch that afternoon to tell me, and she was in the kitchen garden, and when he told her, she stood very still for a moment and then sat down on the low garden wall and put her face in her hands. Not crying exactly. Something more fundamental than crying, the release of a pressure that had been building for months. He sat down beside her on the wall and waited. After a minute she raised her head and her eyes were bright but her jaw was set, and she said, "What about the debt itself? Thomas's debt is still real." The fraud investigation typically results in the voiding of notes obtained through deceptive practices, Joel said. Daltrey says that Hatch's loans in the other 7 cases were all voided when the fraud was proven. There's a strong legal argument that a debt obtained in a context of intended fraud is not enforceable. Mae absorbed this. So the land is safe. The land should be safe. Daltrey will confirm it formally, but yes, Mae, the land is safe. She looked at him. She had the faint traces of tears she hadn't quite shed on her cheeks, and her hair was loose again, and she was sitting in her kitchen garden in the August afternoon, and he thought she was one of the most remarkable people he had ever met in his life. He did not say that. Instead he said, "Clara's going to be all right." Mae's breath caught. "She is," she said. And then quietly, with all the weight of 6 months in it, "She is." The weeks that followed were strange in a way that Joel found himself thinking about often. The crisis was over, technically. Hatch was in custody. The injunction was confirmed. The investigation was proceeding. He should have gone back to the Broken Spur. He had a ranch to run, cattle to manage, 100 tasks that had accumulated in his absence. He kept finding reasons to come back to the Carter place. He told himself it was practical. Mae still needed help with the investigation process, navigating the legal correspondence with Daltrey, managing the responses that came in from Harold Pitts, understanding the timeline of the fraud case. All of that was true. He was useful. He had contacts and knowledge and experience with legal processes that she didn't have, and those things were genuinely needed. But he also came because of the evenings on the porch. Because of the kitchen table conversations that started as practical discussions and became something else. Because of the way Clara had decided that he was a fixed and reliable feature of her universe, and greeted him every time he arrived with the kind of uncomplicated enthusiasm that only children and animals offer without calculation. Because of the way Mae looked at him sometimes when she thought he wasn't paying attention, with an expression that was trying very hard not to be what it clearly was. He brought her books from his library. She had mentioned once that Thomas had owned a few books, and she'd read them all twice. He brought her a collection of poetry and a volume on the natural history of the New Mexico mountains, and a history of the territorial government that she fell on with an interest that surprised and delighted him. She read quickly and with fierce attention, and she had opinions about everything she read, which she expressed with a directness that he found consistently refreshing. This history is written as though the Apache and Navajo were obstacles to civilization rather than people living in it, she said one evening, looking up from the territorial history with that sharpest green gaze. "Most histories in this territory are," Joel said. "That's the injustice of it. she said. And no one who writes the histories thinks it's an injustice. They think it's just the way things are. They think it's the way things were, Joel corrected. History gets written about the past as though it were inevitable. The people who were displaced don't get to write the history. Mae looked at him. Did you know that when Thomas and I first came to this land, there was a family who had been grazing it seasonally, Apache people from the southern band, and the territorial surveyor just drew a line and said it was ours. Thomas felt terrible about it. He tried to make it right, to leave the southern pasture open during their seasonal movement. By the time he died, he still hadn't entirely resolved that in his conscience. That's the honest version of history, Joel said. Most people don't let themselves sit with that discomfort. Thomas did, Mae said quietly. That was one of the truest things about him. It was, Joel thought, also one of the truest things about Mae, that she held those complicated moral weights without trying to put them down. September came in with the first cool edge to the mornings, the cottonwoods beginning their turn to gold, the mountains sharpening in the cleaner air. The Hatch case was moving steadily toward a formal hearing. Daltrey had communicated that the territorial prosecutor was confident in the fraud charges, and that the void of the fraudulent notes was essentially certain. Mae Carter would keep her land. Joel had known for a month, more honestly perhaps 6 weeks, what was happening inside him. He had been careful with it because the timing was delicate, and the circumstances had been so serious that it would have been wrong to add the weight of his own feelings to everything else she was carrying. But September was different. The acute danger was past. The land was safe. The legal process was in competent hands. Mae Carter was, for the first time since he had known her, in a position to breathe. He came to the ranch on a Thursday in mid-September, not with papers or news, but simply because it was Thursday and he had found himself wanting to come. He brought a basket that Rosa had packed, food for supper, which he offered as he had learned to offer things to Mae, without fuss or ceremony, because she accepted things more easily when they weren't made into a production. Clara was doing her lessons at the kitchen table when he arrived, a primer open before her, and a look of concentrated effort on her small face that was exactly her mother's expression of focused attention. She greeted him with the usual directness. "Mama's in the garden. She's been pulling weeds for an hour, which means she's thinking about something hard." Joel smiled. "How do you know weeding means thinking?" "Because she always does her hardest weeding when something's difficult," Clara said, with the absolute certainty of a child who has spent 7 years paying close attention to one person. "She weeded for 3 days after Papa died." Joel set Rosa's basket on the counter and went out to the garden. Mae was kneeling between the rows, her hands in the dark soil, and she looked up when she heard him, and something in her face went from complicated to simple, which was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. "I brought supper," he said. "Rosa's cooking or yours?" "Rosa's. I'm a decent camp cook at best." Mae sat back on her heels and pulled off her gardening gloves and looked at him with the full, undivided attention she gave to things that mattered. "You've been coming here twice a week for 5 weeks, she said. "I have. The legal things that need doing could probably be handled by correspondence." "They could." She was looking at him steadily. "So why do you keep coming, Joel?" He had thought about how to answer this. He had considered several approaches, some careful, some oblique, and he had rejected them all because they were not right for Mae Carter, who had no patience for indirection in any form. "Because I want to," he said, "because this is where I want to be, and because I think you know why, and I think you've been waiting to see if I would say it plainly." Mae was very still. "I'm not saying it as a pressure," he said. "You've had 6 months of loss and 6 months of crisis, and I would not add to what you carry. If you need more time, you have it. If you need space, you have it. But I think you should know what's true, and what's true is that I have not wanted to go back to the broken spur alone since the first morning I sat at your kitchen table." Mae stood up. She was dusty from the garden and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she looked at him with those green eyes that had looked at him first with suspicion and then with assessment, and then with something growing gradually deeper and clearer over 5 weeks of honest, unguarded company. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "I know I'm still grieving Thomas. I know that's real and that it doesn't end on a schedule. And I know that what I feel when you come through that gate is also real, and that the two things can both be true at once." "Yes," Joel said, "they can. I'm not the same person I would have been before Thomas died. Some of what the last 6 months did to me is permanent. I'm harder in some places than I used to be, more afraid of things going wrong." "Those aren't flaws," Joel said. "That's just who you are now, and who you are now is who I know." Mae Carter looked at him for a long, quiet moment in the September garden with the cottonwoods beginning to turn gold and the mountains blue in the distance. Then she crossed the small distance between the rows and stood in front of him and said, "Then come to supper. And come to supper next Thursday, and the Thursday after that." It was not a declaration. It was something more practical and more real than a declaration, an invitation to continue, an opening of a door. He understood it exactly. "I'll be here," he said. The Hatch hearing concluded in late October. The territorial court found Cornelius Hatch guilty of fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy in the acquisition of land through false documents. The sentence was 7 years in the territorial prison in Santa Fe. All notes and mortgages associated with his fraudulent operation were voided in their entirety. Mae Carter's 20 acres were returned to her free and clear, the debt extinguished along with the man who had manufactured it. She got the news from Daltrey by letter, which arrived on a Tuesday morning when Clara was at school and Walt was in the far pasture, and the ranch house was quiet. She read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. Then she went to the window and looked out at the land, at the familiar shape of the corral and the barn and the pasture running east, and she felt something unlock in her chest that had been locked since February. Joel came on Thursday as he had come every Thursday for 2 months. He saw her face when she came out to meet him and he knew immediately. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. She hugged him then, not a careful or tentative thing, but the full, unreserved hug of someone allowing themselves something they've needed for a long time, her face against his shoulder and her hands holding the back of his coat. He put his arms around her and held her solidly in the way of someone who had no intention of going anywhere. They stood in the yard like that for a minute or more, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. After that, things moved with the natural momentum that things have when they were already in motion. Joel began staying for Sunday suppers as well as Thursdays. He brought Clara a book about the animals of the southwestern mountains that she read until the cover came loose. He and Walt developed the easy, shorthand communication of men who respected each other and were working toward the same ends. He began doing small repairs around the Carter ranch on his visits, not because he was asked, but because he noticed things that needed doing and had the skills to do them, and Mae accepted this in the spirit it was offered, without making it more than it was. He did not try to kiss her until November, by which point the question of what they were had been answered in every way except the most direct, and the delay had less to do with hesitation than with a mutual, unspoken agreement to let things build at their own pace and not rush past the honest, layered thing that was happening between them. It happened on a November evening when the first real cold had come down from the mountains, and the ranch house smelled of wood smoke, and the supper Rosa had sent, which Mae had reheated, and Clara had gone to bed, and they were sitting by the fire in the easy silence that had become the natural texture of their evenings. Mae was reading. Joel was looking at the fire. Somewhere in the middle of the nothing in particular of the moment, he looked over at her and she was already looking at him, book forgotten, and the look between them was so full and so unambiguous that everything else was simply a formality. He leaned across and kissed her softly, and she kissed him back, and it was the kind of first kiss between two people who already know each other, nothing tentative about it, just the formal recognition of something that had been real for some time. When they separated, she looked at him with those green eyes and said, "Finally." He laughed, which was a relief, because it had been a long several months and laughter felt like the right punctuation. He asked her to marry him in December, not with any particular ceremony but in the most natural way, which was over the kitchen table after supper, simply and directly, because that was how they spoke to each other. "Mae Carter, I would very much like you to be my wife. I'd like to make a proper life with you and Clara at the Broken Spur if that suits you, or here, if this is where you need to be. I'm not particular about the geography as long as the people are right." Mae was quiet for a moment. Clara would have to change schools. The school in Cimarron is closer to the Broken Spur than to here. It would actually be better for her. The Broken Spur is larger than this place. We could run them together. The boundary between the parcels is mostly a survey line, not a physical thing. Walt could manage the Carter operation with Sam and Billy. We'd be one ranch in practice. She was thinking through it with the practical thoroughness she brought to everything. He let her think. "I want to keep the Carter name on the eastern parcel," she said finally. "The Carter land for Clara." "Of course," he said immediately. That was never in question. Mae looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Joel Fletcher, yes." Clara's reaction when they told her the following morning was to look between them with a child's uncanny perceptiveness and say, "I knew. I told Mama 2 months ago that you were going to stay." "Did you?" Joel said. "I told her it was fine with me," Clara said gravely, as though delivering an official statement, in case she was worried. Mae was simultaneously exasperated and undone by her daughter, which was, Joel had learned, a permanent condition. They were married in February, which was poignant in ways both painful and right, because it was the month Thomas had died, and making February into something new felt like the most honest possible way to carry the grief forward without being trapped inside it. The wedding was small. Rosa was there, and Walt, and Daltrey came down from Santa Fe because Mae had written to tell him the news and he had replied that he wouldn't miss it. The judge who had confirmed the injunction married them in the front room of the Broken Spur, with the winter mountains in the window behind them. Clara wore a blue dress that Rosa had made and stood beside her mother with the solemnity of someone who understood the weight of the occasion. And at one point during the simple ceremony, she reached up and took Joel's hand, which was not scripted, and which cost him something in the chest that he hadn't expected. After the ceremony, they ate at the long kitchen table that was now their shared kitchen table, and there was wine that Joel had been saving for something worth saving it for, and the evening was warm and slow and full in every sense of the word. That night after Clara was asleep and the house was quiet, Mae sat at the window of their bedroom and looked at the land in the moonlight, the broad sweep of the Broken Spur pastures running south and east to where the Carter land began, all one geography now, continuous and unbroken. "What are you thinking about?" Joel asked, coming to stand behind her. "Thomas," she said honestly. "I'm thinking that I hope he knows that she's safe, that I'm all right." She paused. "That I'm more than all right." Joel put his hands on her shoulders gently. "I think he knows," he said. He didn't know if it was true, but he believed it was what she needed, and it was what he would want if their situations were reversed, that someone would tell the person he'd loved that she was safe and more than all right. Mae put her hand over his. "I'm glad you answered your door," she said. "I'm glad you knocked." Spring came, and with it the steady work of a combined ranch operation that was genuinely better for the consolidation. Walt proved to be an excellent foreman with a broader mandate and the authority to manage across both parcels. Billy and Sam flourished under his direction. Joel's existing hands at the Broken Spur, Hector foremost among them, integrated with the Carter crew without friction because Walt and Hector were essentially the same kind of man, serious and skilled, and not interested in complications. Mae threw herself into the Broken Spur with the same focused energy she brought to everything, learning the larger operations rhythms and finding, within a few months, the areas where her eye for detail and her willingness to push back against received wisdom made her genuinely indispensable. She had opinions about the cattle breeding program, and she turned out to be right. She had opinions about the supply contracts, and she turned out to be right about those too. Joel told her this with the unhesitating frankness that he had learned was the only kind of honesty she valued. "You have better judgment about commercial things than I do," he said one evening. "I'm better with the land and the animals. You should manage the business side." She looked at him with slight surprise. Most men would not say that. Most men would be leaving money on the table then. Mae smiled at him. It was a full smile, not the almost smile of that first difficult day, but the real thing, the thing he had been trying to earn from the beginning, and it made the room different. In June, Mae told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning in the kitchen with her characteristic directness, standing at the stove with a coffee cup in her hand and the golden early light coming through the window. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "Probably January." Joel was at the table with the ranch ledger, and he set down his pen and looked at her and felt something so large and uncomplicated that he had no sophisticated word for it. Joy perhaps was the right word. Simply joy. "January," he said. "I think so. Rosa has more experience with these things than I do. She confirmed my calculation. Rosa knew before I did. I told her yesterday." I needed someone to confirm I wasn't making it up. He was beside her quickly, his hands gentle on her face, and she looked up at him with an expression that was happiness and something slightly awed in the practical edge of a woman who was already thinking about what needed to be arranged. "We'll need to adjust the winter schedule," she said. "We will," he agreed. "I'm not going to be fragile about it. Clara didn't slow me down, and this one won't either." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be fragile," he kissed her forehead. "I'm just very happy." She softened in the way she did sometimes when he said the simple, direct thing. "So am I," she said. Clara received the news with the equanimity of a child who has already had to adapt to a great many things, and has decided that adaptability is simply a character trait rather than a hardship. She asked practical questions. How big would it be? Where would it sleep? Could she teach it to read when it was old enough? She seemed satisfied by the answers. The ranch continued its work through the summer and autumn with the pleasant rhythm of a place that is functioning as it should. Cattle drove well and prices held in September. The winter stores were better than they had been in 2 years. Mae's garden produced extravagantly, and Rosa preserved everything that wasn't eaten fresh. Joel hired an additional hand to help carry the load before Mae's confinement, a quiet man from Taos named Ernesto who turned out to be exactly what the operation needed. Doyle was found, as a footnote to the Hatch affair, in Arizona Territory in October, arrested there on a separate charge of robbery. He gave testimony against Hatch in exchange for a reduced sentence that the territorial court in Santa Fe accepted. The Hatch case was thereby fully closed, every thread tied. Cornelius Hatch would serve his sentence. The families he had defrauded had their land back. The machinery of justice had, in this instance, actually functioned. Joel told me about Doyle's capture and confession one evening in October when the leaves were fully gold and the mountains were wearing the first snow on their peaks. She was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, her pregnancy evident now, reading the territorial history she'd finished and was rereading because she said she kept finding things she'd missed the first time. She listened to the account of Doyle's arrest and Hatch's additional testimony convictions, and then she was quiet for a moment. "It's done," she said. Not the way she'd said it in October after the hearing, with the relief of acute crisis ending. Something quieter and more permanent. "It's done," Joel confirmed. She looked at him over the rocking chair's arm. "I rode to your ranch that morning thinking you were my enemy," she said. "I know. I had the foreclosure notice and that forged letter, and I was so angry. I was so frightened and angry, and I thought if I could just confront the man whose name was on that letter, if I could look him in the eye and demand an answer, then at least I would know what I was facing." She paused. "I wasn't prepared for you to be who you are. Who did you expect?" "Someone like Hatch," she said simply. "Someone who had made a calculation about my land and my situation, and decided that the calculation favored taking it." That's what I'd spent 6 months dealing with, people who looked at me and saw an opportunity. She looked at the fire. And then there you were, reading that letter with genuine shock on your face, and I thought, either he's a very good actor or he actually didn't do this. And you decided I wasn't a good enough actor. I decided your shock was real, she said. And then you opened your ledger without being asked. She smiled at the memory. That's when I started believing you. A man with something to hide doesn't open his records unprompted. Joel leaned forward in his chair. Do you know what I thought when I opened the door and saw you standing there? What? That whoever you were not afraid of anything. Not of me, not of the situation, not of what the answer might be. You were angry and exhausted, and you'd ridden 4 miles in August heat on a hope, and you stood there with that letter like you were going to take on every wrong thing in the territory single-handedly if you had to. Me laughed softly. I was terrified. I know, but you didn't let it stop you. She reached across and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. Neither did you, she said. The baby was born in January, as me had predicted, and it was a boy, which Joel received with a wonder that made the usually composed rancher temporarily inarticulate. He was born on a cold, clear night when the stars were brilliant over the Cimarron Range, and he was healthy and loud, and arrived into the world with a thoroughness that impressed even Rosa, who had seen a great many arrivals. They named him Thomas Joel Fletcher, Thomas for the man whose land and love had built Mae Carter into the person she was, and Joel because the name carried forward, and Fletcher because that was the name on the deed to the land they were going to raise him on. Clara met her brother the following morning with the grave attention she brought to important things, looking at him for a long time in Me's arms before pronouncing her judgment. He looks like Papa Thomas, she said, around the eyes. Me and Joel exchanged a look over their daughter's head, a look that held grief and gratitude, and the particular compressed tenderness of 2 people who have built a life together out of honest materials. He might, Me said gently. We'll have to wait and see. The winter turned to spring, and Thomas grew with the reliable industry of a healthy baby, and the ranch moved through its 2nd year as a combined operation with the increasing ease of a thing that had found its proper form. Joel expanded the cattle herd in a careful, measured way that paid out through the summer. Me, returning to full operation after Thomas's arrival, reorganized the supply contracts in a way that saved them substantially on a yearly basis, and invested the difference in a breeding program for the horses that Joel had been wanting to attempt for years. They had dinner on the porch on warm evenings when the day's work was done, the 4 of them, Clara doing her reading and Thomas sleeping in a crib that Joel had built through the winter, Me and Joel talking about the ranch and the territory, and the books she was reading and the questions Clara asked, and the 100 ordinary, irreplaceable things that make up a life lived together. One evening in the 2nd summer, with Thomas sitting up and reaching for everything within his considerable reach, and Clara reading aloud to him from the natural history of the mountains in the earnest, instructive tone she had adopted as his educator, Joel looked at Me across the table. She was watching their children with that expression he had come to know as hers entirely, the love in it complete and fierce and grateful all at once. She felt him looking and turned, and the smile she gave him was the full one, the real one, the one he had been trying to earn from a dusty August morning in his front yard and had been earning every day since. He thought about that morning sometimes, the way she had stood in the August sun with the foreclosure notice, and the forged letter, and her chin up, and her eyes burning with that particular quality that was both fury and fear. The way she had asked her question, direct and unflinching, and the way the question had cracked open something in both of their lives that had needed cracking open. She had arrived with a problem and a question, and he had answered both before sundown. He had not expected what would come after the answers. He had not expected the 5 weeks of Thursday suppers and careful, growing trust. He had not expected the kitchen table and the gray pre-dawn, the quiet shared sleeplessness that had built something more permanent than most people built in years. He had not expected Clara announcing that she had approved the arrangement 2 months before he even asked, or the February wedding with the mountains in the window, or the boy named Thomas sleeping in the crib he'd made with his own hands. He had answered the question, and the question had changed everything. Mae reached across the table and took his hand without looking away from him, and held it with the easy certainty of someone who was exactly where she meant to be. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "August," he said. She understood immediately. "A lifetime ago," she said. "Not so long." "No," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "Not so long." Thomas reached out and grabbed a fistful of the tablecloth with enormous satisfaction, and Clara said with exasperated affection, "Thomas, no." And Mae laughed, and Joel laughed, and the evening settled around them all, golden and full and permanent, the way things are when they have been built right and built to last. 2 years after that first August morning, the Broken Spur and the Carter land together constituted the finest cattle and horse operation in Colfax County, and everyone in Cimarron knew it. They knew also that the woman who ran the business side with a ledger and a direct eye had saved it twice over, and that Joel Fletcher, who had built the reputation of the Broken Spur through a decade of honest work, had found in his wife someone who matched him in every way that mattered and surpassed him in several. Mae Carter Fletcher, as she was known now, though she kept Carter as her middle name the way some people keep a previous life as part of their current one, was 33 years old, the mother of a daughter who read voraciously and asked difficult questions, a son who was beginning to walk with the determined waddle of a child who has decided uprightness is a project worth pursuing, and the co-owner of a ranch that her hard work and Joel's had made into something neither of them could have made alone. Walt Greer had stayed, as she'd always known he would, and at 60-odd he had become something between foreman and patriarch, a figure of such unshakable reliability that both the Carter operation and the Fletcher side operated with the easy confidence of a place that knows it is in good hands when the owners are elsewhere. Clara, now 9, had taken to riding with her stepfather in the mornings before school with the commitment of someone pursuing a serious education, and Joel taught her about the land with the same care he brought to everything, showing her how to read the grass and the water and the sky, how to understand what the cattle were telling you and what the mountains were saying about the coming weather. One morning in the third autumn, riding the boundary line between the Broken Spur's eastern pasture and the Carter land, Clara said, "Will I have the Carter land someday, when I'm grown?" "Yes," Joel said. "It's yours. It's always been yours. That's why your mother kept the name on it." Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking in her characteristic way. "Mama cried when she got the legal paper," she said. "That said Hatch couldn't take it anymore." "I know she did." "She doesn't usually cry," Clara said. "She cried when Papa Thomas died, and she cried that time, and she cried when baby Thomas was born." She considered. "Those are good reasons." "The best reasons," Joel agreed. Clara looked at the land on her left, the rolling eastern pasture that had been Thomas Carter's and would someday be hers. "I'm going to take care of it," she said, with the simplicity and totality of a 9-year-old's conviction, "the way Papa Thomas would have if he'd had more time." Joel looked at this girl, who was not his by blood and was entirely his in every way that mattered, and felt the same expansion in his chest that Thomas's arrival had produced, that open, uncomplicated thing that the sophisticated word joy was only partially adequate for. "I know you will," he said. They rode the rest of the line in the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other, under a sky that went on forever in every direction, blue and clean and enormous, above the land that had been worth fighting for, and was worth every fight that had been required. When they came back to the ranch yard, Mae was in the kitchen garden with Thomas on a blanket beside her, and she looked up when she heard the horses and shaded her eyes with her hand. The morning light was doing that October thing it did in New Mexico, all gold and clarity, making everything sharp and distinct against the blue distance. Joel swung down from his horse and walked across the yard and kissed his wife and scooped up his son and stood in the garden of the place they had built together, and thought that the widow who had arrived at his gate with a foreclosure notice and a question had answered something for him in return that he had not known until she arrived, that he was waiting to be answered. The question she had answered was simpler than the one she had come with. It was not about fraud or forgery or the mechanics of corrupt land dealing. It was not legal or procedural. It was the oldest and most fundamental question that people ask, not in words but in the whole of how they move through their days, whether there is someone in the world with whom the work of living becomes not easier exactly, but fuller, more complete. Whether the land you work and the life you build is something that wants a witness, a partner, someone to sit across the table from and argue about territorial history with, someone whose hardness in some places and softness in others is a map you learn over time and find yourself glad to know. The widow had arrived with a foreclosure notice and a question. The rancher had answered both before sundown, and the sun had not set on them since. Clara came running from the corral where she'd turned her horse out, and Thomas reached for her with the whole-body enthusiasm of a toddler who loves his sister without qualification. And me laughed at something, Clara said, and the sound of it carried across the garden in the clean October air. And Joel Fletcher stood in the middle of all of it and understood completely what it meant to be a man who had found exactly the right life at exactly the right time. Not by searching for it, but by opening his door on an August morning to a woman with courage enough for both of them and the sense to ask the right question.